Today we're about to peel back the layers on something we all think we have control over, but rarely do: the way our brains interpret the world. So, let's dive into one of the trickiest questions we face daily. Who or what is warping your world? The truth is, our brains are constantly playing tricks on us, filling in the gaps, drawing from past experiences, and creating a version of reality that isn't always accurate. And believe it or not, this affects more than just how we see things. It influences our emotions, our decisions, and even the stories we tell ourselves about success and failure. You've probably heard that we learn from our mistakes, right? Or that failure is the best teacher. Well, it turns out that's not entirely true. A study conducted at MIT in 2009 revealed that we actually learn much more from success than we do from failure. When we succeed, our brain's neurons adjust rapidly, fine-tuning themselves to recognize what worked. But after a failure, the change in neural response is much smaller. In other words, our brains don't automatically learn from mistakes unless we force them to. This means if we want to grow from failure, we have to be intentional about it. Think about that for a second. If your brain doesn't automatically learn from mistakes, you have to put in the extra effort. You need to reflect, imagine how you would have done things differently, and visualize the successful outcome. To your brain, imagining success can be just as powerful as experiencing it. It rewires your brain to behave differently in the future. The trick? You have to be willing to put in that work. Our brains don't just play games with success and failure. They mess with what we see too. The world we perceive isn't a perfect reflection of reality. Far from it. Imagine your eyes as a camera, but one with limited resolution. Most of what we think we see is actually filled in by the brain based on past experiences. For example, when you walk into a cafe, you don't register every little detail. Instead, your brain uses the general layout from previous visits to fill in the blanks. That's why optical illusions work so well. They take advantage of the fact that our brains are constantly making predictions. Here's a scenario. You're walking down the street and spot someone who looks like your partner, sitting at a cafe with someone else, even though they said they'd be home. Immediately, suspicion creeps in, but what you're seeing is not entirely real. From a distance, your brain is using familiar knowledge, your partner's face, their usual clothes, to fill in the gaps. Your eyes can't make out all the details, so your brain fills in what it expects to be there. This is why it's so important to take a second look before jumping to conclusions. Your brain is not always as reliable as you think. Speaking of brain tricks, let's talk about biases. You've probably heard of anti-bias training and thought it was unnecessary because you don't consider yourself prejudiced, right? Here's the thing. Biases aren't always conscious. We all have implicit biases, formed by years of exposure to certain ideas, media, and social structures. These biases aren't about being a bad person. They're about how our brains are wired to recognize patterns. And sometimes those patterns lead us astray. Take cognitive bias, for example. We think that more information helps us make better decisions, but in reality, too much information can lead to overload. Overthinking and sifting through irrelevant data can make decision-making harder, not easier. Another example is hindsight bias, the tendency to believe after something has happened that we knew it all along. This false sense of predictability makes us overconfident in our ability to foresee the future, when in fact, we didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle. And then there's decline bias, the belief that the past was better than the present or future. We romanticize the good old days and criticize the present, even when the facts don't support it. The 24-hour news cycle only fuels this bias, bombarding us with negative information and reinforcing the idea that things are getting worse. Our survival instincts naturally focus more on the bad than the good because our brains are wired to seek out threats. But we have to be intentional about recognizing the positive in our lives. It takes effort, but it's worth it. All these tricks, whether it's the way we see the world, the way we react to failure, or the biases we hold, shape the way we live every day. Our mistakes and our successes, our eyesight and our biases, all have a massive impact on how we move through life. The key to living a better life is understanding that some of our actions and thoughts need to be intentional. We have to actively reflect on our failures, be aware of the limitations of our senses, and consciously check our biases. When you understand how your brain warps your reality, you can start making changes. You'll learn to doubt your first impressions, to be more forgiving of yourself when you fail, and to be more curious about the world around you. This awareness gives you power to stop generalizing, to stop making assumptions, and to start living a more intentional life. So, as you go out into the world today, remember that your brain is constantly filling in the gaps, shaping your perception, and influencing your actions. But now you know the tricks, and you can use that knowledge to your advantage. Stay mindful, stay curious, and remember, until next time, keep on rising.